Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jonathan Brent, Executive Director of the Yivo Institute. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here for what I think is going to be an intriguing lecture on the Polish underground and the Jews, a topic of great and hot debate for a long time, in which there are many partisan views. Nearly every fact is subjected to a great deal of contention and debate. So this will be, I think, a very lively and very important lecture. I want to thank the family of Ruth Gay and the members of her family who are here today. I want to thank, in particular, Fruma Moore, our senior archivist at Yivo, for envisioning how these Ruth Gay seminars will take place. And I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to mention in this context, because I think it's very appropriate, the two things. One is the project that we now have underway to digitize all of our pre-war collections, some 1.5 million documents and about close to 10,000 books of Yivo's pre-war collections. These were seized by the Nazis. They were taken to Frankfurt and then discovered by the U.S. Army after the war. Another part of it remained in Lithuania. This is a very, very big, very important project in the Jewish world. It is the largest project to digitize materials of the Jewish world of Eastern Europe in the world today. And those of you who are interested in helping to support this project, I ask you to pick up a brochure from the table outside and consider doing so before the end of the year. Every gift, no matter how large or small, counts toward digitizing a book, toward preserving a document, and ultimately toward creating the website that will be necessary for presenting all of this material free of charge online to the world. The other thing I wanted to say in connection to today's topic is that we have, for the first time, inaugurated something that is called the Shine Trust Online Educational Series at the Yivo Institute. And the first course that is being offered online in January of 2016 is taught by Samuel Kassow. I think that name is known to most of you, or many of you. He is teaching a 6-hour course on the subject of the history of Ashkenaz. And so it will, in 6 hours, cover the history of the Jewish people in Ashkenaz over a 1,000-year period. It is the first time we have experimented with online teaching. It is a very important initiative which will help us reach people around the world who want this knowledge and who cannot find it in their home communities. To date, after having put this course online for registration about a month ago, we have almost 800 people around the world from 35 different countries. Israel, Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Romania, Paraguay, Bolivia, South Africa, and Chile, Canada, the UK, France, Germany. It's astounding, the response to this course that we have seen around the world. And we have responses from people in over 40 of the states of the United States, from all over the United States. What this means is that what Yivo's message is, what Yivo does in the world, is resonant throughout the world. And I want to bring this course to your attention. It is free of charge. The introductory offering is free of charge. I hope that many of you will consider signing up for it, telling your friends about it, posting links to it on your websites or blogs or whatever. Because we hope in the coming year to develop 6 additional courses, put them online as well. And this will be our way of communicating with a world much bigger than the tri-state area of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Anyway, let's get on with the lecture today, and I now want to ask Fruma Moore, Senior Archivist of Yivo, to provide the rest of the introductions. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you all and to thank you for coming to today's Ruth Gay Seminar in Jewish Studies. Given 3 times a year, thanks to a major gift from the family of Ruth Gay, the seminar or lecture is presented by scholars who have used the resources of the Yivo archives and who wish to share their research with the public. Ruth Gay, who passed away in 2006, was a noted American Jewish scholar who wrote on a wide range of subjects relating to Jewish life in Europe and the US. Her love of archives and of archival research and her book about the Jewish King Lear, a Yiddish play by the playwright Jacob Gordon, which was published posthumously by Yale University Press, often brought Ruth Gay to Yivo and to the reading room. I would like to acknowledge and express my deep appreciation for the family of Ruth Gay for their continued support of this important Yivo program. And I would also like to acknowledge Margaret Gorenstein, who was here with us in the auditorium, daughter-in-law of Shirley Gorenstein and niece of Ruth Gay, who was here today as a representative of the family. I'm not sure where you are. So let's give a hand to the family of Ruth Gay. Thank you very much for your support. In publicizing today's lecture, we've reached out as usual to the broad public, as well as to the academic community, including students and faculty at Brooklyn College, New York University, the Association of Jewish Librarians, Touro College Graduate Jewish Studies, Columbia University, and the Harriman Institute at Columbia, as well as academic fellows here at Yivo and at the Center for Jewish History. I'd like to thank everyone who's helped make this program happen. First, Jonathan Brent, Executive Director of Yivo, for his recognition of the importance of this program and for his strong support of it. To Dr. Mila Sholochova, Head Librarian and Acting Chief Archivist, for her continued enthusiasm and support. To my colleague Etty Goldwasser for her excellent and dedicated coordination of the Ruth Gay Seminar. Helena Gindi, Leah Falk, volunteers of Yivo and the CJH, and the staffs of the Yivo Institute and the Center for Jewish History, including Melissa Manaya, Michael Stafford, and Yoni Lam, who was videotaping the session. I'd like to draw your attention to the discount flyers for Dr. Joshua Zimmerman's book, The Polish Underground and the Jews, the subject of today's lecture, which can be obtained in the Great Hall after the lecture. There are also some sample copies of the book sent for your convenience by Cambridge University Press. After the lecture, please join us outside in the Great Hall for some light refreshments and for an opportunity to speak to Professor Zimmerman. Please also note about what Jonathan just mentioned, that there are Yivo membership and program materials in the Great Hall. We encourage you to pick up these on the way out. Today's topic, the Polish Underground and the Jews, has much significance for all of us here today, and especially for the Yivo Institute, not only because Yivo has collected important original documents about the Holocaust in Poland, as well as about the underground in Poland, but also because Yivo itself received secret communications from Emanuel Ringelblum, who was a Yivo research associate and a founder of the secret underground archives, which you may have heard about, the Onek Shabbat archives of the Warsaw Ghetto, which had existed until the ghetto was destroyed in April 1943 after the uprising. As the head of the Onek Shabbat archive in the underground archive was called Emanuel Ringelblum, and his colleagues in the ghetto, at risk to their lives, secretly collected and hid evidence about the Holocaust, about the concentration and death camps, as well as information about the conditions in the Warsaw Ghetto itself. Thus, during the war, Dr. Ringelblum, a Jewish historian closely affiliated with Yivo before the war, continued the Yivo tradition of collecting documentary evidence about anti-Semitism, which could be used to tell the truth to the world when the opportunity arose. That was why Ringelblum and the other members of the secret archive voted that after the war, if the archive survived, that it should be transferred to the Yivo Institute. While only a small portion of the original Ringelblum archives is here at Yivo, and the bulk of the archive has remained in Poland at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, the leaders of the Onek Shabbat archive selected Yivo as the institution to receive its archive because of their recognition of Yivo's leadership role in the field of collecting documentary evidence about Jewish life in Eastern Europe. After the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, Ringelblum managed to get over to the Aryan side of Warsaw, where he hid with his family. In March 1944, he and his colleague Adolf Berman sent a secret coded message addressed to Yivo in New York. So this was in the middle of the war. The coded Polish language message was smuggled out of Poland by the Polish underground and brought to London, where the Polish government in exile was based. In London, the document was deciphered and decoded and sent to Max Weinreich in New York. Only a few days later, after Ringelblum wrote this letter, the Nazis discovered his family hiding place and on the Aryan side of Warsaw and killed him and his entire family. On the other side of the ocean, in New York, the letter was translated into English, and Yivo issued a press release. And the letter that you see here on the screen, there's 2 pages that we have scanned here. It has been at Yivo since 1944. It's not the original one. Oh, then it's not working. Yoni? Okay. Yoni? Okay, got it. So this letter that you see up on the screen is in Polish. The original was in secret code. It was sent in code by the Polish underground to London, and it was decoded in London and sent to New York. The letter was signed, and so on this, I take this opportunity to ask everyone to close your cell phones, because I just heard someone's cell phone going off, so please, everybody in the audience, please close your cell phones. It's still the beginning of the program, and there's time for everyone to do that. We appreciate your cooperation. Thank you. Now, this letter was signed by Emanuel Ringelblum. This is the same person who was the head of the underground archive in the Warsaw Ghetto. Can you see his signature? You see Dr. A. Berman, and underneath it, Dr. E. Ringelblum. And this letter was smuggled out because Ringelblum wanted Yivo and the world to know, after the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, after the uprising had been put down, he wanted them to know that despite all the difficulties faced in the Warsaw Ghetto, that the Jews of the ghetto continued to carry out all their cultural and spiritual and artistic and educational activities. So it's a letter about heroism and resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto, and it's a very, very, very unusual original document that's held here at Yivo. And we're sharing it with you today just as an introduction to the subject of the Polish underground, because Yivo was part of this liaison and this network. Now, the Yivo Archives has a very significant collection of original documents on the Holocaust. We have original fragments of the Vilna Ghetto, of the Lodz Ghetto, and as I mentioned to you before, the Warsaw Ghetto, a very small portion of the original Warsaw Underground Archives that If you read about the milk cans where they were hidden, a very small portion is here at Yivo. We also have thousands of eyewitness accounts, including by survivors who submitted their testimonies to Yivo from the 1940s on all the way to the present. And we have original books, registers, certificates from Auschwitz, from Buchenwald, and other concentration camps. So Yivo is actually, in North America, Yivo is the most important institution with original documents on the Holocaust. The Holocaust Museum, which was founded in 1993, based a lot of its initial work on what Yivo had collected and what other archives had collected, because they only started in 1993, but Yivo started in 1943, and even before that. Just to share with you some of the Yivo Archives collections of original documents relating to the Polish underground and the Polish government in exile, we have the Michael Zilberberg collection, which is actually consists of hand-typed copies of parts of the records of the Polish government in exile in London. The Arthur Ziegelboim papers. Ziegelboim was the person who was in the Polish government exile who committed suicide when he found out what happened to the Jews and what had happened in Warsaw. And his suicide note, his original suicide note is here at Yivo. We are temporarily loaning it to the Museum of Jewish Heritage, where you can find it on display if you visit the Museum of Jewish Heritage. We have the Emanuel Scherer papers. Emanuel Scherer was also a member of the Polish government exile, the Abraham Malezin papers, and other collections as well. So before asking our moderator, we should go straight to Josh? Okay. All right, so then, in that case, so we're not going to, I have it. So we just wanted to give you this introduction to show you that a lecture about the Polish underground at Yivo is not something that just takes place by chance. It's something which is important here and has a deep historical connection. So we will go right over and introduce you to our special keynote speaker today, Joshua Zimmerman, who is professor of history and the Eli and Diana Zborowski holds the Eli and Diana Zborowski Professorial Chair in Holocaust Studies and East European Jewish History at Yeshiva University. He's the author of Poles, Jews, and the Politics of Nationality, The Bund and the Polish Socialist Party in Late Tsarist Russia by the University of Wisconsin, which is a book based heavily on materials from Yivo's Bund archives, and the editor of 2 contributed volumes, Contested Memories, Poles and Jews During the Holocaust and Its Aftermath, Rutgers University Press, and Jews in Italy Under Fascist and Nazi Rule, 1922 to 1945, Cambridge University Press. His recent publications include a chapter in Warsaw, the Jewish Metropolis, Essays in Honor of the 75th Birthday of Professor Antony Polonsky, published by Brill. I now welcome Joshua Zimmerman to give the Ruth Gay Seminar in Jewish Studies. Thank you.
Well, first let me thank Fruma, Senior Archivist at Yivo, and Eddie Goldwasser, Archivist, and in particular the family of Ruth Gay for giving me the opportunity to speak at Yivo today and present the research based in part done at the Yivo archive for my new book. I used 2 main collections two of which are noted on this slide. One is the Michael Zilberberg Papers, Record Group 493, which contains documents on the Polish government in exile and the Polish underground on Jewish matters, and also the Abraham Malezin Papers, Record Group 1872, which became available only in 2010. I will speak about him in this presentation. He is a unique figure. He was a Polish Jew who served as a lieutenant in the Home Army in the Nowogród district, posing as a Catholic Pole, and through this experience, heard many things, observed many things that are in his unpublished memoirs that are included in this particular collection, memoirs that no one read until after his death in 2008 at the age of 98. I was able to make contact with him before before 2008, he would only allow contact through email. He wouldn't meet me personally. He didn't feel well, but in the 2 or 3 email correspondences, there was some critical counsel and advice he gave me, which is, and before I go into the lecture, which is that he said that the Home Army, the Polish underground in Novogródek, had a very specific and particular history. It had to be observed and looked at as a subject in and of itself. And here are 3 monographs in Polish that you must read to have any basic knowledge of anything that was going on in Novogródek. So he was trying to encourage me to look at this very much on a local level, that is to say province by province, as opposed to generalizing about the Polish underground. Okay, so let me just begin. I'm going to read a little bit from my lecture, which summarizes basic findings in the book. Now, until very recently, our understanding of the Polish underground's wartime record was overwhelmingly negative. Holocaust survivor testimonies and scholarly studies in the West argued that partisans of the Home Army, those clandestine forces in Nazi-occupied Poland loyal to the Polish government in exile, were just as dangerous to Jews as were the Nazis. And the specific cases on which these claims were made were no doubt accurate. But new evidence demonstrates there was another side to the story. In my book, The Polish Underground and the Jews, 1939 to 1945, published by Cambridge University Press in June of this year, I show that alongside documented cases of crimes against the Jews, individuals and groups within the Polish underground played more of a role in aiding Jews than was previously known. Now, to be sure, Polish scholars between the 1960s and the 1990s had already documented cases of righteous Gentiles within the underground, but in works that entirely excluded anti-Jewish acts and anti-Jewish views from the historical record. The Polish underground itself grew and evolved considerably throughout the war, growing numerically and spreading by 1942 to all parts of pre-war Poland. By December 1940, the main structure of the underground was established with 3 branches: a civilian, military, and political wing. Now, this is here, page 176 of my book. It's a chart that I constructed. Not that it probably took maybe 2 to 3 years to try to figure out this structure, because there was conflicting information in the secondary works, but it shows the main structure of the underground with the 3 branches. We'll see, and I'll say something about that the highest the highest office in the underground was the government delegate, who presided over the delegates' bureau, consisting of departments and ministries that were intended upon liberation to function as a kind of provisional government. That's to say, the ministries down here below would act as parts of the government. There would be a cabinet of ministers, and the government delegate in the homeland would be the provisional prime minister. Now, and this is a chart on page 126 of my book. Now, the military wing, the Home Army, which until February 1942 was actually called the Union of Armed Forces, was headed by a commander in Warsaw who swore allegiance to the Polish prime minister and commander-in-chief in London, Władysław Sikorski. In June, excuse me, let me just do one thing here. This will, oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. As someone told me, there's not enough real estate up here. So I now have it, thank you. Here we go. Now, in June 1940, General Stefan Rowetzky was named Home Army Commander, a post he held until his capture in June 1943. He was known as the most wanted man by the Germans in occupied Europe. In 1942, the Home Army adopted an emblem that became a powerful symbol of resistance to occupied Poland. Resistance in occupied Poland to the Nazis and Soviet occupations. The Home Army's Bureau of Information and Propaganda produced 1 in every 5 underground periodical newspapers in occupied Poland, including the Home Army's central organ, Bulletin Informacyjny, the largest circulation underground paper in occupied Poland. It was a weekly that by 1943 had a circulation of 43,000. Again, all illegal underground papers. Now, in 1942, both the Home Army and the Delegates Bureau established Jewish aid divisions. They're shown in this chart. So just to make it noted, in bold, I have the Jewish aid organizations embedded in the structure of the Delegates Bureau, and here the aid organizations within the Home Army. Now, we'll go here. I'm sorry, this was, I forgot to show this of the underground. The central organ of the Home Army was Bulletin Informacyjny, and this is just an example that I happened to find. It was in a bookstore in Warsaw that had original wartime documents, and they had copies of Bulletin Informacyjny, and I happened to come across this issue at this bookstore, leafing through it, found this editorial cartoon, which I found very, very powerful, as a powerful anti-Nazi motif in the underground newspaper. Now, it was the attorney Henryk Wolinski, a colonel in the Home Army, who established the Jewish Affairs Bureau in February 1942. The intelligence he gathered on Nazi crimes against the Jews was delivered to the Home Army's central headquarters in Warsaw. Home Army Commander General Rawecki passed reports by secret courier to London with cover letters vouching for their accuracy. As the shocking materials arrived in London, the Polish government in exile leaked documents to the Western media. The result was that the New York Times and the Times of London informed the world in June 1942 about Nazi death camps and the use of poison gas for Hitler's insane plan to annihilate European Jewry. In November 1942, the celebrated courier Jan Karski arrived in London to deliver firsthand news about the Holocaust to the world. And I think he's probably maybe the most known member of the Home Army. And I think, as you know, the representatives of the Jewish underground convinced him to personally go into the Warsaw Ghetto so he could see with his own eyes what was going on. He agreed to do that. He was smuggled on 2 occasions in the Warsaw Ghetto, out of the Warsaw Ghetto, successfully got out of Nazi-occupied Europe, and in November 1942 found himself in the office of the Prime Minister of Poland, Sikorski, and told his firsthand account about there, and then 2 Jewish organizations as well. Sorry, 2 Jewish organizations as well. Now, the Polish underground leaders thus became the first to receive and disseminate to the free world news on the emerging Nazi final solution to the Jewish question. Now, in December 1942, what's more, the Polish government in exile appealed to the world to intervene militarily on behalf of Polish Jewry at a meeting of the United Nations. So this is a publication from December 1942 by the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs titled The Mass Extermination of Jews in German-occupied Poland. It also includes original documents that had just arrived from occupied Poland, coming from Henryk Wolinski and the Jewish Affairs Bureau, and again from the Home Army. And these were excerpted and then translated into English. Now, meanwhile, in occupied Poland, Meanwhile, in occupied Poland, Wolinski took the organizational initiative for establishing Żegota, the Polish Underground's Committee to Aid the Jews. I want to just show where this fits in the underground structure. So in my chart, in my book here, you'll see that, if I can get this right here. So Żegota was part of the Delegates Bureau ministry called Internal Affairs. Under their Security Bureau is where they established Żegota, Council for Aid to the Jews. Its executive committee consisted of also Polish Jews, including Adolf Behrman, for example, and others. And so, in fact, they became the de facto representatives of Polish Jewry within the Delegates Bureau. So in my book, I show, for example, that the Jewish members of the Executive Committee of Żegota were able to communicate directly with the Polish government in exile in London because the government delegate up here, the government delegate himself, would use their own couriers and include in them notes from the Jewish members of Żegota directly to the Prime Minister's office or to Jewish members of the Polish National Council. So in this way, we can say that in some ways, Polish Jews had representation in the Delegates Bureau. Now, Wolinski also served, I'm going to go back to, to Wolinski so we can see him. Okay, now, Wolinski also served as liaison between the Jewish resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto and the Home Army, effectively persuading the Home Army commander, General Rowecki, to order the transfer of arms, ammunition, and explosives materials into the Warsaw Ghetto prior to the uprising. In February 1943, for example, we have in the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw a document written by Rowecki. It's an order to district commanders to provide military aid to Jews inside ghettos wishing to mount self-defense. Now, what we know, unfortunately, is that the vast majority of commanders and sub-district commanders outside of Warsaw simply ignored that. But nonetheless, the order was given. Now, on the first day of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Rowecki ordered the Warsaw District Home Army chief to carry out a mission to blow up the ghetto wall to allow for mass escape. The mission was assigned to Captain Józef Pszeny, here, to Captain Józef Pszeny. He was deputy commander of the Warsaw District Home Army. And from the information I was able to gather, we could use this timeline. That is to say that on the first day of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, on April 19th, 1943, at 6:20 p.m., Pszeny led his unit towards the outskirts of the ghetto on Bonifraterska Street with a 63-kilogram explosive device. But before reaching the wall, a group of Polish Blue police spotted them and alerted the nearby German SS. A heavy exchange of gunfire took place. 3 German gendarmes and 2 Polish policemen were killed. 2 of Pszeny's soldiers, Józef Wilk and Eugenia Morawski, were killed, and 4 were wounded. 8 minutes after the operation began, Captain Pszeny ordered his troops to retreat with the dead and wounded. The Home Army commander, in fact, General Rowecki, had already been regularly warning London about German crimes against the Jews. For example, he cabled to the Polish government, we're going back a little bit in time here, he cabled to the Polish government in January 1941 about the horrific conditions and treatment of Jews in the newly established Warsaw Ghetto. In April 1942, for example, Rowecki warned London in a cable, quote, that, quote, everywhere mass executions and shootings of Jews are taking place in Poland, unquote. His sympathy for the Jews found expression in the Home Army's central organ, Bulletin Informacyjny, which means informational bureau, informational bulletin. Now, after the first death camp for Jews began operating in Belzec, the clandestine paper's powerful moral voice was unmistakable, and I quote, the extermination, I quote from a piece from April 30th, 1942, quote, the extermination of the Jews is, in the literal sense of the word, now taking place. While the initiator is Hitler, we cannot close our eyes to the fact that these crimes have taken such a monstrous form only because of those people ready and willing to carry out Hitler's intentions. The sea of blood will be an eternal blot on the German nation, unquote. When the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising broke out, 1 year later, a Home Army paper stated, quote, these beasts in human forms have lapped up their fill of Jewish blood, and will wash their victory down in the pubs of Warsaw, unquote. Now, the Home Army's coverage of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was considered vital enough that the New York Times did a story about the paper's coverage of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So this is the New York Times from September 25th, 1943, in which they reprint the cover of Bulletin Informacyjny and have a story on that. It's an article by Andrzej Kamiński, who was the editor-in-chief of this paper. He, after the war, was honored by Israel as a righteous Gentile because of his efforts in Jewish rescue. Here, he penned this piece, Ostatni akt wielkiej tragedii, the last act of a great tragedy. Now, more and more attention has been paid to the celebrated figure of Żegota, Irena Sendler. Now, head of the children's section, she is credited with saving 2,500 Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto and was shortlisted for a Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 at the age of 96. She passed away the following year. Her network of collaborators included the 32-year-old Jadwiga Deneko. In 1942, Deneko brought children smuggled from the Warsaw Ghetto to a safe house in Warsaw, placing each in convents and orphanages after securing the necessary sets of false papers. One of the Jewish children Deneko saved was Katarzyna Melach, who was 10 years old in August 1942 when Deneko rescued her from the Warsaw Ghetto during the so-called Great Deportations, when an estimated 300,000 Jews were deported from the Warsaw Ghetto. Katarzyna stayed in Deneko's apartment for several weeks before a fake birth certificate was obtained. Deneko then arranged for the young girl to stay at a Catholic convent in Turkowice. This is Katarzyna Melach right here. Katarzyna survived the war and later commented that, quote, not only did Deneko arrange for my false birth certificate, which was my armor and savior, but she kept in contact with me when I was in Turkowice. She wrote me letters and sent me care packages, unquote. At one point, Deneko wrote the convent a letter asking them to change Katarzyna's location. Deneko feared that if she was captured and tortured, she might give up Katarzyna's whereabouts. The nuns decided to keep Katarzyna, but to remove her name from the record of children staying there. When the Gestapo captured Deneko on November 25th, 1943, she was hiding over 10 children in her apartment in Warsaw. Imprisoned and tortured, the Germans failed to extract the name of a single Jewish child or their Polish helpers. Jadwiga Deneko was executed by firing squad at Pawiak prison in Warsaw on July 8, 1944. Over 40 years later, the Department of the Righteous at Yad Vashem honored her with the title of Righteous Among Nations and planted a tree in her honor. Now, Irena Sendler's collaborators also included Jadwiga Piotrowska, who used her Warsaw home as a safe house for hundreds of Jewish children smuggled out of the Warsaw Ghetto. Her success in saving so many Jewish children was in part due to her close collaboration with Jan Dobrczynski, a social worker who ran the Division on Abandoned Children for Warsaw's Social Welfare Department. A member of the Home Army, Dobrczynski forged documents for Jewish children stating that they were Catholic orphans. He applied the department's official stamp and his own signature to each document. Despite the dangers involved, Dobrczynski worked with Piotrowska to place over 200 Jewish children in orphanages and convents during World War II. Piotrowska and Dobrczynski were not, we can say, isolated figures, but were joined and supported by many others within the Polish underground. As Konstanty Gerbert, who's the esteemed Polish Jewish journalist in Warsaw, as he recently commented to me, quote, Aid to the Jews became actually one of the Polish underground's mission during the course of the war, even if it was applied inconsistently, unquote. Now, in the ranks of the Home Army, there were several local leaders involved in aid efforts. In the village of Hanachuv, located in the province of Lvov, the local Home Army commander, Lieutenant Kazimierz Wojtowicz, ordered residents of the village of Hanachuv to build bunkers on their farms in which to hide Jews. Lieutenant Wojtowicz also sanctioned the formation of a Jewish self-defense unit, which is shown, a picture of which is shown here. A Jewish self-defense unit under Home Army command. He provided weapons, ammunition, and training. As the situation of the Jews deteriorated, Lieutenant Wojtowicz issued an order to the local population in September 1942 to help Jews in any way possible. When in April 1944, German police and their Ukrainian helpers attacked Hanachuv to ferret out the Jews, Lieutenant Wojtowicz ordered his men to evacuate the whole population of to a nearby village. A German SS division then entered and was met with stiff resistance from the Home Army and its Jewish platoon, holding the enemy at bay long enough to complete the evacuation. It is estimated that of the 250 Jews who hid in Hanachuv, 180 survived the war. How did I come across this particular story? So I knew nothing about this story until I attended a lecture in 2009 at the American Society for Yad Vashem's annual banquet, and their guest speaker was Selma Horowitz from Great Neck, New Jersey. There she talked about her harrowing experience of survival in occupied Poland, and she is from Hanachuv, and she mentioned that she was kind of incidentally in the lecture that she was saved by the Polish underground. Of course, that interested me, and I approached her after the lecture, and she agreed to meet with me later, and I conducted an interview, and excerpts from that interview are here, and then she was the one who informed me that Lieutenant Wojtowicz, the commander, wrote an actual memoir in Polish, an obscure Polish publisher from 1992, in a limited edition of 100 copies. I was able to get a hold of that, and that really laid out the entire story, but also its accuracy was confirmed at the Department of the Righteous of Yad Vashem in his file, because he was honored as righteous among nations, and those whom he saved submitted testimonies. And so every part of his story I was able to compare to the testimonies, and they were all accurate. So clearly a quite extraordinary contrast to other things we've heard about Poland and the Jews during World War II. Now, one could also include the quiet and reserved Henryk Pochowski. He was a lieutenant in the Lvov District Home Army. Now, while serving as the head of the counterintelligence unit of the Lvov District Home Army, Pochowski became involved in Jewish aid work in spring of 1943. Now, while I was looking at unpublished memoirs in the Institute of History of the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw, I came across his file, and there was his unpublished memoir, in which Pochowski discussed his work finding shelter for Jewish escapees from the Lvov ghetto. Now, when a local Polish resident, in his own home, we learn in the memoir, Lieutenant Pochowski hid a Jewish man until the end of the war. Now, when a local Polish resident discovered Pochowski's secret and tried to blackmail him, Pochowski appealed to the underground court that prosecutes collaborators. The fate of the blackmailer is told to us in one sentence in the memoir, and I quote, "The blackmailer was killed on the streets of Lvov in broad daylight. We had no mercy for such anthropoid hyenas," unquote. So there's just kind of a fascinating, it's a very, very long memoir, but his authenticity in terms of his kind of outrage about anti-Jewish sentiment is very strong. He also recounts in that memoir being in a kind of cafe and overhearing a conversation between kind of a local German authority and a Polish woman he calls a aristocratic Polish woman who was, I guess, expressing her not delight but satisfaction about how the Jews of Lviv are being treated. Although she did note apparently in this memoir that she was uneasy with the methods being used by the Germans to carry out their plan. And so in the memoir he says he didn't know who was worse, the German or the Pole. So he mentioned that, but he was clearly kind of very upset by that encounter he heard. Now, I also discovered a number of cases of local Home Army members risking their lives to save Jews. For example, I'm going to go for one that I profiled in my book. In Vilna, for example, there is the extraordinary case of Lieutenant Bronisław Krzyżanowski and his wife, Helena. I received these photographs from the granddaughter of this couple, who is now, I believe, age 49 and lives in Poland, and through someone that I happen to know that will come up. That's how these photographs became available, and they're reprinted in the book. Now, Krzyżanowski used Home Army resources to provide false papers and housing for several Jewish families who fled from the Warsaw Ghetto. One of these was the family of Eliash Baron, shown here, a young Polish Jew whom Krzyżanowski knew from before the war. Eliash fled the ghetto and joined Krzyżanowski's unit, tragically falling in battle in November 1943. But before Baron's death, Krzyżanowski arranged for Baron's wife and 5-year-old son, Zev, or Wojtek, to be smuggled out of the ghetto and stay at the family's country home in Ponaryszki. So this is just a map to show you that the Krzyżanowski family had this country home, and and Zev and his mother stayed there for the duration of the war. They survived the war and immigrated to Palestine in 1945. Today, 80-year-old Zev Baron serves as honorary consul of the Republic of Poland in Jerusalem. There in 2005, I met with him and did a long interview, and he provided me, for example, with this extraordinary photograph. The other part of that story is that in November 1943, it turned out that Eliash Baron's wife was pregnant with their second child. And so in 1944, the second child was born, and so it's Guta Baron, the wife, and the son, and then the newborn who survived actually in the Krzyżanowski home. What I wanted to say here is that for the survival of the family, Krzyżanowski arranged the creation of the production of false documents. And so this is an example of the false documents that allowed Guta Baron, Eliash Baron's wife, and Zev Baron, the 5-year-old son, to survive the war. These are fake identity papers produced with the resources of the Vilna District Home Army. Now, other cases include Olga Słowik and her mother, Karola. Now, Olga was active in the local Home Army in Starachowice in the Kielce province. In November 1942, after the liquidation of a local ghetto, an 18-year-old Jewish woman, Halina Zawadzka, knocked on their door and pleaded for help. They took her in. Olga arranged for false papers, and Halina ended up joining the local Home Army. Halina stayed with Olga and Karola until the Soviet liberation in January 1945. How do I know about this story? Well, Halina Zawadzka wrote in 2007, she wrote a memoir in Polish. I'm sorry, I had that wrong. It was 2001. And she emigrated to the United States after the war, and today, at the age of 90, she lives in Florida. I read her memoir. I was able to contact her, and she allowed me to interview her at length on the telephone, and excerpts from that interview are in the book. Now, we can say that a much more known case is that of Jan Żabinski, head of the Warsaw Zoo. Now, a member of the Home Army, Żabinski and his wife, Antonina, are credited with having hid 200 Jews on the grounds of the Warsaw Zoo during the course of the war. Made famous by Diane Ackerman's award-winning account from 2007, The Zookeeper's Wife, the book will be made into a major motion picture and is expected to be released in 2017. Now, there is also the case of Jews in the Warsaw, in Warsaw's special commando units of the Home Army. One of them was Stanisław Aronson, who fled from the Warsaw Ghetto in January 1943 and joined the Home Army in Warsaw. Now, the unit commander who accepted Aronson, Lieutenant Colonel Józef Rybicki, knew Aronson was Jewish. Aronson trained and then fought during the Warsaw Uprising in August-September 1944. His comrades eventually discovered Aronson was Jewish, but according to Aronson, did not care, including his closest friends in the unit, the couple Beata Branicka and Leszek Rabinski. Aronson survived the war and later wrote in a 2004 essay, quote, "In our detachment, there was never even the slightest manifestation of anti-Semitism," unquote. He lives today in Tel Aviv. I also had the privilege of interviewing him. Now, in what we can say, indeed, perhaps the most prominent case of Home Army rescue of Jews took place during the Warsaw Uprising. During the Warsaw Uprising. On August 5th, 1944, the Zośka Battalion of the Home Army captured the German concentration camp called Gęsiówka, liberating 348 Jewish prisoners. This is a photo of Jewish prisoners from the last German concentration camp in Warsaw that was liberated. 348 were freed. Some of them then joined the Home Army, but Aronson is shown here. Aronson is shown right here in one of the battalions that helped free Jews. So he's right here. And then this is a photo from that I found in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and that is of a Home Army soldier who liberated who was escorting these two Jewish ex-prisoners from the German concentration camp and protecting them from German sniper fire. Now, with regard to the top leadership of the Polish underground, we can say that it publicly condemned German crimes in the first half of 1943. In the first half of 1943, on April 30th, 1943, Jan Jankowski, delegate of the Polish government in the homeland, called upon Poles to aid Jews fleeing the Warsaw Ghetto. The most powerful condemnation of the Polish underground, however, was reserved for Polish blackmailers. Now, blackmailing Jews and their Polish helpers, they stated, constituted treason and carried the death penalty. Now, this notice here, which is noting to the Polish population that blackmailing Jews is treason and punishable by death, was a powerful message because it was signed not only by Jan Jankowski, who's the he's the government delegate in the homeland, but also by the Home Army commander at the time. So in other words, the two top officials of the underground were communicating to the Polish population that this is crossing a red line. Now, on April 15th, 1943, a Home Army editorial characterized the problem of Polish blackmailers in the following message, quote, "It is strange how luxuriously the poisonous flower of foul deeds and cowardliness has proliferated on our war-torn soil, and in particular in the Warsaw region. Here in the capital, the worst, most vicious dregs of society are preying on the most unfortunate of our countrymen. We must burn out the scoundrels of this type from the body of society," unquote. Now, in September 1943, the Home Army used the pages of its central organ to announce, in this announcement here, this was on the front page of this newspaper, that a Polish man, Bogusław Pilnik, had been executed by firing squad for the crime of blackmailing Jews. Okay, now the other side of the story, which is, what about those hostile forces of the Home Army or the Polish underground? So let me talk about that aspect of the story now, because we can say that it was in part an accident of personalities that resulted in the marked deterioration in relations between the Polish underground and the Jews. In June 1943, the Gestapo captured Home Army Commander General Rowecki, who was considered the most wanted man in occupied Europe, and he was replaced by General Tadeusz Komorowski. A sympathizer of the right-wing anti-Semitic National Party, General Komorowski reversed the policy of his predecessor, refused to provide aid to Jews in ghettos wishing to mount self-defense, and favored the exclusion of Jews from the ranks of the Home Army. With a chilling indifference towards the fate of the Jews, Komorowski tended to characterize Jewish partisans as hostile, pro-Soviet elements, an attitude that gave local Home Army units a green light to treat Jews any way they wished. In fact, documents trace 2 orders to attack Jewish partisans in the Novogrudok district back to Komorowski himself. His well-known report from August 1943 on combating banditry in the countryside revealed a striking lack of understanding for the tragic predicament of the Jews desperately trying to survive as partisans in the East. What's more, General Komorowski decided in March 1944 to incorporate into the Home Army a large section of the openly anti-Semitic extreme right-wing National Armed Forces, an organization that characterized communists, Jews, and Soviets as Poland's primary enemies. It was also in the second half of 1943 and in 1944 that witnessed a rise in anti-Jewish activities of local Home Army units. The new hostile face of the Home Army was reflected in the figure of Colonel Władysław Liniarski, commander of the Białystok District Home Army. On June 30th, 1943, Liniarski ordered his sub-district commanders, quote, to liquidate at once with total ruthlessness Polish spies, communists, and Jewish communist bands, unquote. In December 1943, after the liquidation of the Białystok ghetto, he commented in a report to Warsaw that, quote, the absence of Jews in trade and in the Białystok district is a true blessing, and thank God for the Polish people who have expressed themselves loudly in this regard, unquote. Perhaps the most hostile region of the Home Army was the northeastern district of Novogrudok. As you see here, right on the pre-war Polish-Soviet border. Now, this was a region we should remember. This was a region we should remember that Soviet Russia openly regarded as Russian territory, right? This region of pre-war Poland, and where Soviet partisans were numerous beginning in the second half of 1943. So it's extremely complex. It's the battleground for control over the eastern borderlands. Now, the Novogrudok District Home Army commander, Colonel Janusz Szlaski, regarded Jews as hostile Soviet elements. Novogrudok was, for example, 82% rural and one of the most backward areas of pre-war Poland. Jewish testimonies from the region confirm that the Novogrudok District Home Army refused to accept Jews based on the argument that Jews had been pro-Soviet during the Soviet invasion of 1939. So when Jews fled ghettos, were denied entry into the Home Army, and then went into Soviet partisans, that, according to the Home Army in that region, was proof of anti-Polishness among the Jews. Now, in September 1943, Colonel Szlaski noted in a monthly report that he had ordered a sub-district unit to, quote, cleanse, unquote, the Lipiczański forest of what he called Soviet Jewish bands, unquote. An important source on the Novogrudok District Home Army is the late Abraham Melizin, a Polish Jew from Vilna who served as an officer in the local Home Army, posing as a Catholic. Now, upon his death in 2008, I mentioned this before, at the age of 98, Melizin left his unpublished papers and memoirs with Yivo that became available in 2010. In his memoirs, written in English, Melizin referred to Colonel Schlosky as an extreme anti-Semite who did nothing to curb anti-Jewish actions among his fighters. Now, he had a unique, of course, perspective. He was inside the Home Army, posing as a Catholic Pole, and there he reports on what he heard people say and the actions that he observed. Now, Melizin also commented on chance conversations he had with locals in the city of Lida. And I quote, "In my accidental encounters with people from the nearby village and Lida itself, almost everyone expressed satisfaction that the Germans got rid of the Jews. The majority did not approve of murder, but the isolation in the ghettos was treated as a good move by the Germans," unquote. Excuse me. Melizin recounts his meeting with the notorious the notorious figure, Lieutenant Adolf Pilch. Now, Pilch had parachuted into occupied Poland from London in February 1943. He was assigned to the Novogrudek district to help organize the local Home Army. Now, when he came to Lida, the representative of the Home Army in Lida was none other than Abraham Melizin. And so, according to Melizin, Pilch arrived in Lida and declared that his mission was, quote, the struggle against Judeo-communism, unquote, Żydokomuna. Now, eventually, Pilch was made commander of what was called the 78th Home Army Infantry Regiment in the town of Stopsa. I'm just going to show you where that is, right here, in this city here. So he led the Home Army Division in that town near the Naliboki Forest where the Bielski brothers had created their family camp. In January 1944, Pilch signed a notorious ceasefire agreement with the local Germans in exchange for weapons, which he then used to combat Soviet and Jewish partisans. In one report, Pilch recounted the following. So this is a report that he gave to the district commander of Novogrudek, and I'm quoting. "On September 17th, 1943, a squadron that was in the area encountered a group of Jewish partisans, pillagers, who were ruthlessly pillaging a village, ruthlessly plundering a village. The squadron leaders approached them, disarmed them, and then began to bring them to a camp some 25 kilometers away. The Jews tried to flee. They were shot and discreetly buried," unquote. So this is just an internal document of the Novogrudek District Home Army. Now, open expressions of anti-Jewish hatred could also be found in local Home Army reports. In Garvolin, a town of less than 10,000 inhabitants in the Warsaw District. I'm not sure why that happened. Okay. Oh, here we go. So in Garvolin, a town of some 10,000 inhabitants in the Warsaw District, the Warsaw Region Home Army Chief, his name was General Albin Skroczynski. He filed a report in December 1943 about activities of the underground in that city or in that town. Now, the report was something like 52 pages, but it included 2 sentences about the Jews and is included in the Home Army archives in Warsaw. And this is what he wrote, quote, "There is certain sympathy for the Jews. It is better, however, that they are no longer here and nobody desires them to return after the war," unquote. So that's the entirety of his position on Jews. So obviously, this reflects his own view. We don't know what locals thought, but as much his own view as his attempt to kind of extrapolate local views. Now, I'm going to go back to General Komorowski for a moment. And just to say that General Komorowski, much more lenient with extremist nationalist groups than his predecessor, also accepted into the Home Army something called the Kadra Strike Battalion under the command of someone named Bolesław Piasecki. Now, some of you may know about Bolesław Piasecki. he was, according to the Polish scholar Szymon Rudnicki, a genuine fascist. In 1935, Piasecki founded something called the National Radical Camp Falangia. Its 1937 program was modeled after the Nuremberg laws, yet was even more extreme. Let me just quote from the 1937 program. Quote, Jews in Poland will be removed and their possessions will be seized through legal measures. The expulsion of the Jews from Poland will be preceded by the expropriation of their property and its return to the Polish nation. Unquote. It went on to say that Jews will be deprived of the right to engage with Polish businesses, to employ Poles, and Jews will be will be barred from public school. So he was of course, on the extreme fringe, nowhere near even the right or the center, but this was his view at that time. Now, in October 1943, Piasecki commanded a very extreme right-wing group called the Quadristrike Battalion. It numbered at that time about 1,600 men, but it was incorporated by General Komorowski into the Home Army in the Novogródek region as the 3rd Battalion of the 77th Home Army Infantry Regiment in Novogródek. The inclusion of Piasecki's 3rd Battalion in Novogródek undoubtedly intensified the climate of hostility towards the Jews. There is also evidence that General Komorowski sanctioned the use of Piasecki's and Pilk's and also Adolf Pilk's units to strike Jewish partisans. I'm saying this only from evidence, and that is that in General Komorowski's organizational report number 240, covering the period September 1st, 1943 to February 29th, 1944, he writes the following comment on the Novogródek district, and I'm quoting, quote, the highest priority in the Novogródek district is the display of self-defense in the face of hostile Soviet partisans and Jewish communist bands, unquote. Komorowski then noted that Piasecki's battalion and Adolf Pilk's battalion were being assigned to that task of creating self-defense in the face of so-called Soviet and communist Jewish bands. Now let me conclude. I can say that in conclusion, the Home Army was an umbrella organization numbering over 300,000 by 1944, with members drawn from all regions of pre-war Poland and from all social and political backgrounds, ranging from socialists and peasants to nationalists. Its attitude and behavior towards the Jews during World War II thus varied widely from extreme acts of aid to acts of murder. Yet in focusing, as we must on the latter, we are in danger of forgetting the former, that alongside documented cases of crimes, there were individuals and groups within the Polish underground that risked their lives to save numerous Jews. Thank you very much. Now, do I stay right here or I go? Okay.
Josh, thank you so much for your very balanced and thorough, comprehensive narrative, which you covered all sides of the question in very brief amount of time that we had today. We just touched on the essence of the question, but I think that now we're about 10 minutes late because we're running about 10 minutes late, but we're still okay. So we have 2 people here manning the microphones, and we're opening up the to question and answer. The gentleman in the blue and white stripe, the blue and black striped T-shirt in the middle of the Etsy. Right.
It's not on.
It's okay, we can hear you, sir.
What finally happened to Komorowski and Piasecki and the Bielski brothers? Was that the movie upon which they were based upon?
I'm sorry, the last 2, there was Komorowski and then who?
Pielski? No, the fascist.
the Bielski brothers.
No, Pielski. Komorowski and Pielski, the bad guys.
Oh, yes, okay, I'm sorry.
And then you mentioned about very briefly the Bielski brothers who were fighting in that area.
Yes.
Was that was that which the movie with Craig was, last name Craig, was based upon?
Yes, yes. So starting with Komorowski, I think you know that he remained Home Army commander until October 4th, 1944, and that is that on that day he surrendered to the Germans during the Warsaw Uprising. It came to an official end on that day, and he did an official surrender, and he was taken. He was in captivity. So he then is no longer active in the Home Army, and then he is replaced by the last Home Army commander, whose name is Okolitsky, which has a tragic fate, which is when the Soviets come, they do take 16 members of the Polish underground, including him, to Moscow, and there's a show trial in Moscow. And I believe that now I don't remember, but I think he may have been executed. All of them were. Yes, it's a famous case of the show trials. And of course the irony there is that the accusation in the show trial is that they were Nazi collaborators. So that's the irony there. But in terms of just Piasecki, he then remakes himself as a communist in post-war Poland. It's a very bizarre story. So he's obviously someone who was an opportunist, and so if the communists were in power, so he then moved up the ladder of the Communist Party and took some act in 1968 in the anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic anti-Semitic actions of the government in 1968. Yes, please. Is this some? Oh, yes.
Yes. Do you think that the Soviet intelligence was well aware that many units in the Polish Home Army were anti-Soviet, and that was a factor why the Russians permitted the Nazis to wipe out the Home Army?
Yes, that's a fascinating topic. We do have these cases in Novogrudok and in Bialystok, and we have one case in Tarnopol in the southeast, in which Home Army units signed ceasefire agreements with the Germans and then turned against the Soviets. And what's interesting is that at the conference in November 1943 of the Big Three, the first conference, Stalin actually brought that up, which is the reason why he had already severed diplomatic relations with the Polish government in exile. Britain, in particular, was pushing him to reestablish relations. But then he said they're collaborators with the Nazis. There's no way I can do that. They've actually sanctioned, or somehow the underground has made these ceasefire agreements with the Germans. So he used that as a pretext to permanently sever relations with the Polish government in exile, and then declare permanent annexation of eastern Poland, which is what you call diplomatic aerobatics, right? Because of course he got that territory from a Nazi-Soviet pact, but so that definitely came up in Soviet positions. Right. No. They lived to be right. Well, now, in the case of Komorowski, he goes into exile right after the war, and he spends the rest of his life in London. And in 1950, he wrote his own memoirs called The Secret Army, published in English in 1951 and in Polish in 1950. It's kind of on the Jewish matters. It's kind of a revision of things that happened. But he becomes a major activist in the kind of Polish emigre community. What we know, I just want to say, is that it's known that there are a series of post-war trials from 1949, 1950, 1951, up through 1956, in which members of the Home Army were accused of crimes against the Jews. And so I have an entire chapter that discusses that, which is at these trials, some of the members make admissions of guilt on that. But then after de-Stalinization, often those sentences are dramatically commuted or lessened. So there is actually consequence in post-war Poland for these trials. They're for collaborators.
There's two more questions. The lady in the beige or yes. Who was responsible for appointing Komorowski, and how much did the Sikorsky government know about what the policies of the Home Army were at that point?
Right. So it's maybe the greatest Polish tragedy of World War II from a diplomatic position, which is that I didn't mention to you that Rowecki is captured on June 30th, 1943. 5 days later, Prime Minister Sikorsky died in a plane crash. They call it Black Week, but literally in 1 week, the two top military command, because Prime Minister Sikorsky also held the title Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. So in 1 week, the two top military commanders of Poland disappeared, and so they were replaced. Now, so Sikorsky, so what we have, both of them are replaced. So Komorowski wasn't chosen, and at least interestingly, kind of like in the Polish literature, there's a consensus that he wasn't quite qualified to actually be commander in terms of his background. That he was very vulnerable to his kind of entourage, and there is a lot of critique about him actually calling the uprising in August 1944, because the basic prerequisites that his predecessor, Rowecki, had actually already put out and said we can only rise against the Germans in Warsaw if three things are in place, and none of them were in place on August 1st, 1944. So his predecessor said it would be a disaster unless these three things are in place. So he very much differed.
One last question, maybe from somebody in the center or
In the back? There's some, maybe in the back?
okay.
Only one more question?
We're going up because our time is up. You'll be able to ask more questions out in the Great Hall.
Okay.
It's pretty obvious that you have an interest in this. And it's so many names, and it's complicated. For us, many of us, it's a first. We've heard all these rumors. What is your passion? I mean, you have a passion about this. What sparked your interest?
So what sparked my interest was that there was a consensus in the English language literature, especially in Holocaust studies, memoirs, that the Polish underground was hostile to Jews. And I didn't question it that much because I wasn't that familiar until I came across an obituary in 2003 of Scylla Wiesenthal, who's the wife of acclaimed Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal, in the New York Times, in which it said that she fled a labor camp and survived the war in occupied Poland thanks to the help of the Polish underground. So when I saw that obituary and I saw that, it really made me wonder, so if the consensus is that the Polish underground was hostile to Jews, how is it that she was saved by the Polish underground? So it began a kind of inquiry, and then I started seeing that actually there were many individuals and subgroups within the underground that did work to save the underground. So I kind of realized then that the whole topic needed a comprehensive re-examination, starting with kind of reopening the archives and then laying out all this evidence and then seeing what the preponderance of the evidence suggested without prejudice, meaning without any prejudice about what the outcome will be, just to look at it. So the idea was not to pronounce a verdict, but to simply present evidence and see where it takes us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zimmerman. We will go out to the Great Hall, and you can continue to discuss, Dr. Zimmerman's book with him with questions. Thank you very much for coming.